Do you still hesitate before turning on the car's interior light? Congratulations! You are a victim of long-term parental propaganda. We spent our entire childhoods terrified of swallowed gum, crossed eyes, and swimming after lunch because our parents were simply too exhausted to explain how the world actually works. These aren't just funny myths. They are the ridiculous lies that shaped a generation. Let's dismantle your childhood trauma, one dumb fact at a time. 1. If you swallow a watermelon seed, a watermelon will grow in your stomach. This wasn't just a lie. It was a psychological operation designed to turn fruit consumption into a life-or-death scenario. Parents had us genuinely believing that our digestive systems were high-speed greenhouses and that one slip-up would result in vines erupting from our ears like a botanical horror movie. We spent summers living in fear of an internal harvest. It didn't make us careful eaters. It just gave us deep-seated anxiety about nature and a profound misunderstanding of how stomach acid actually works. 2. The ultimate dinner table hostage situation. You'll sit there until you finish that. This turned a standard Tuesday night meal into a Cold War standoff between a crying child and a parent wielding a plate of cold, coagulated broccoli. The lesson here had absolutely zero to do with nutrition or world hunger. It was a masterclass in breaking a prisoner's spirit. It taught us that bodily autonomy is a myth, and that the only way to earn your freedom is to shovel radioactive-looking sludge down your throat without gagging. Thanks for the future eating disorder, Mom. 3. If you cross your eyes and the wind changes, your face will get stuck that way. This is perhaps the most medically bankrupt threat in history, implying that your facial muscles are controlled by the local weather forecast. Parents acted like a light breeze was basically meteorological superglue. Nobody ever risked testing it because the penalty was a lifetime of looking like a cartoon character who just got hit with a frying pan. In reality, this was just a lazy way to get us to stop looking stupid in public without having to explain social norms. 4. Find a penny, pick it up, all day long you'll have good luck. This charming rhyme was actually terrible financial advice from the Great Depression era. You were being trained to bend over and touch dirty public pavement for currency that has been functionally worthless since 1982. You could spend 8 hours hunting copper discs, and you still wouldn't have enough to buy a gumball. It taught us to obsess over microscopic, bacteria-laden gains while ignoring the bigger picture. It's not good luck. It's a hygiene violation that pays 1 cent. 5. The pre-internet shutdown tactic. Go look it up in the encyclopedia. Let's be real, this wasn't an attempt to foster independent research skills or intellectual curiosity. This was the verbal equivalent of, "Shut up and get out of my face." It was a brilliant strategy for a parent who had absolutely no clue why the sky was blue and wanted to shift the burden of knowledge onto a 30-pound book set from 1974. You'd lug that dusty tome off the shelf just to find out the map of Europe was outdated, and your parents were just stalling for time. 6. If a wild animal isn't running away, it obviously wants to be friends. This is the Disney princess delusion that leads to tourists trying to saddle up bison in Yellowstone. That raccoon isn't frozen in place because it's mesmerized by your aura. It's calculating the optimal angle to bite your finger off and give you rabies. Parents who implied nature was a petting zoo are the reason we have warning labels on everything. That animal isn't smiling at you, it's baring its teeth. There is a very fine line between a cute encounter and a closed casket funeral. 7. The floor is lava, but only after a 5-second countdown. The 5-second rule relies on the insane premise that germs have a gentleman's agreement to wait before swarming your dropped pizza. It imagines bacteria checking their tiny watches, yelling, "Hold the line, boys. He's still got 2 seconds." It's a beautiful fantasy where microbiology respects the rules of the playground. In reality, you're just eating floor dust, dog hair, and regret. But parents invented this rule so they wouldn't have to cook a second grilled cheese sandwich. 8. The magic words. We were taught that please and thank you were expressions of gratitude, but let's be honest, they were transactional cheat codes. You learned quickly that you could be a complete sociopath, but as long as you inserted the please coin into the machine, you were legally entitled to a cookie. It was less about teaching genuine politeness and more about learning how to grease the wheels of bureaucracy. It was basically our first lesson in corporate networking. You can demand anything you want as long as you wrap it in a layer of fake courtesy. 9. The customer is always right. This beautiful, shining lie was presented as the absolute gospel of American commerce. But it wasn't a business philosophy. It was a training manual for how to get walked all over by someone trying to return a toaster they clearly broke. This single phrase is responsible for birthing an entire generation of entitled nightmares who believe that yelling at a teenage cashier is a valid negotiation tactic. It taught us that reality is negotiable if you just demand to see a manager loud enough. It didn't teach service. It taught us that being a loud nuisance usually gets you free stuff. 10. A little hard work never hurt anybody. This phrase was almost exclusively uttered by a father holding a cold beer while pointing at a pile of rocks he wanted moved to the other side of the yard for no reason. It was a convenient way to reframe unpaid child labor as character building. The reality, of course, is that hard work hurts quite a bit, especially when you're 12 and trying to dig a trench in 90-degree heat. It was a fantastic way to get a project done on the cheap, while convincing your kid that their physical suffering was actually a moral virtue. 11. Go to college, get a degree, and you'll be set for life. This was sold to us as the unbreakable success formula, the golden ticket to the middle class. It was a fantastic plan, right up until the moment everyone else got a degree too, and the value of a bachelor's plummeted to that of a library card. We followed the instructions perfectly, only to end up with $50,000 in student loan debt and a career making espresso for people who dropped out of high school to sell crypto. It wasn't a lie at the time, but the expiration date on that advice had passed long before we graduated. 12. You can be anything you want to be, as long as it's not an artist, musician, or writer. The immediate follow-up to any creative dream was the dreaded starving artist lecture. Parents would encourage you to have hobbies, sure, but the second you mentioned doing it for a living, they painted a grim picture of you eating beans out of a can under a bridge. It was the ultimate bait and switch. Follow your dreams, honey. Oh, not that dream. That one doesn't come with dental insurance. It taught us to bury our passions deep down and just become an accountant like a responsible adult. 13. Before streaming services, there was the sacred ritual of adjusting the TV's rabbit ears. This was presented as a dark art that only your dad understood, a delicate ballet of aluminum foil and swearing. The lesson was that technology was a fickle god that required a human sacrifice. Usually you, standing on one leg holding the antenna while your dad screamed, "Don't move," from the couch. You weren't watching a cartoon. You were part of the circuit. It taught us that entertainment wasn't a right, it was a hard-earned privilege won through physical contortion and static. 14. The teacher is always right. This was the golden rule of public education, designed to crush dissent before it could start. It didn't matter if Mrs. Johnson was having a midlife crisis and teaching you that the sun revolves around the earth. Your job was to nod and take the C-. This didn't create respectful students. It created a generation of people terrified to question authority or point out obvious incompetence. It was our first lesson in bureaucracy. The person with the clipboard is in charge, even if they have absolutely no idea what they are talking about. 15. Answering the landline wasn't a casual act. It was a formal theatrical performance. You were expected to answer with your full name, the family lineage, and a polite inquiry into the caller's health. Johnson residence, Timmy speaking, how may I direct your call? You were basically a tiny unpaid secretary for your own house. Simply picking up and saying hello was treated as a crime against civilization. It made us terrified of the telephone, which explains why no one under the age of 40 answers a call from an unknown number today. 16. Being bored was not viewed as a state of being, it was treated as a moral failing. The moment you made the fatal mistake of uttering "I'm bored," you weren't asking for entertainment. You were confessing to a lack of character. The parental response was never to play a game. It was to hand you a bottle of Windex and point at the windows. We learned very quickly to stare at a blank wall and pretend to be fascinated rather than risk being assigned manual labor. It taught us the valuable corporate skill of looking busy even when we have absolutely nothing to do. 17. You must wait exactly 1 hour after eating before you swim. Parents treated a turkey sandwich like a lead anchor that would drag you to the ocean floor. They convinced an entire generation that digestion was a delicate process requiring absolute stillness, or else you would instantly cramp up and sink like a stone. It wasn't about safety or biology. It was about parents wanting 60 minutes of peace to digest their own lunch on the beach without having to play lifeguard to a bunch of screaming kids doing cannonballs. We sat on those hot towels, staring at the water, counting down the seconds until we were legally allowed to float again. 18. If you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. This sounds like lovely, polite advice, but it's actually a fantastic recipe for raising a doormat. It teaches a child that honesty is secondary to making sure everyone else feels comfortable. It's why so many of us grew up unable to give honest feedback or stand up for ourselves because we were too busy trying to be nice. Sometimes you need to say something not nice because the other person is being an idiot. This rule just turned us all into passive-aggressive experts. 19. The sacred parental duty of embarrassing you in front of your friends. This wasn't an accident or a slip of the tongue. It was a calculated tactical strike. Whether it was pulling out the photo album of you in the bathtub or using slang that died in the 70s, the goal was to dismantle your social standing in seconds. It was a power move designed to remind you that no matter how cool you thought you were, you once ate dirt in the backyard. It was a lesson in humility, delivered with the subtlety of a sledgehammer to the ego. 20. And for the times logic failed, here was the nuclear option. Because I said so. This wasn't a reason. It was a verbal brick wall signaling the immediate and total collapse of rational discussion. It taught us that, in the real world, a well-reasoned argument often loses to the person with the loudest voice and the car keys. It was a lesson in arbitrary dictatorship. You could have a PowerPoint presentation on why you should stay up late, but it was meaningless against the unassailable power of "I said so." It prepared us for every bad boss we'd ever have. 21. You have to hug every relative, no matter what. Polite? Maybe. A fantastic way to blur the lines of consent? Absolutely. We trained entire generations of kids to ignore their own physical discomfort just so Aunt Linda wouldn't feel awkward about her perfume cloud. We were taught that an adult's feelings were infinitely more important than a child's bodily autonomy. Here's a wild upgrade for the modern era. You don't owe anyone physical affection just because you share a genetic code. A high five is perfectly acceptable, and it involves significantly less cheek pinching. 22. Stay loyal to one company and they'll take care of you. This advice came wrapped in a fantasy of a gold watch and a comfortable pension. This corporate fairy tale died somewhere around 1985, but our parents kept repeating it like gospel. The real lesson we learned the hard way was that loyalty is a one-way street, and your 20 years of dedicated service are worth less than a rounding error on a quarterly spreadsheet. They taught us to be loyal dogs in a system that views us as easily replaceable batteries. Thanks for the setup, Dad. 23. Honesty is the best policy. This was repeated like a sacred mantra, right up until the moment you were honest about not liking your grandma's meatloaf. Suddenly, the policy changed to shut your mouth and swallow the lies. We learned very quickly that honesty actually meant tell the truth only when it's convenient for me. The real lesson was learning how to craft strategic, polite, little white lies to keep the peace. By age 10, we were all expert diplomats in the art of fake compliments and insincere gratitude. 24. It is illegal to turn on the interior light while driving. Dads everywhere treated that little plastic dome light like a police beacon that would alert every cop in a 5-mile radius. We grew up genuinely believing that flipping that switch would blind the driver, cause a massive 10-car pileup, and result in immediate jail time for the whole family. In reality, Dad just didn't want the glare ruining his view in the rearview mirror. But instead of explaining optics, he lied and told us we were committing a felony. To this day, I still feel a rush of criminal adrenaline if I have to turn it on to find my dropped phone. 25. The absolute certainty that playing video games would rot your brain. This wasn't based on science, it was based on a deep, primal fear of a glowing box that your parents didn't understand. They saw Nintendo as a one-way ticket to a life of unemployment, completely missing the fact that we were learning problem-solving, resource management, and hand-eye coordination. Joke's on you, Mom. Now people get paid millions to play games, and I'm just here with average reflexes and a mild resentment towards that statement. 26. Don't run with scissors. This was a reasonable safety tip that somehow became the 11th commandment. We were taught to fear the deadly combination of cardio and office supplies more than actual threats. Parents acted like tripping with scissors was a guaranteed fatality, while simultaneously letting us ride bikes without helmets and drink from the garden hose. We were prepared for a very specific, scissor-based apocalypse while being completely woefully unprepared for things like compound interest or emotional regulation. But hey, at least we walked slowly while crafting. 27. Eat your carrots. They give you night vision. We all believed we were one vegetable away from being a low-budget superhero with optical powers. Turns out, this was literal British propaganda from World War II to cover up their new radar technology from the Germans. Your parents were just unknowingly passing on military deception to get you to eat a root vegetable. I ate 5 pounds of carrots a week, and I still stub my toe in the dark every single night. I feel betrayed by both my mother and the British Ministry of Information. 28. And finally, the most powerful justification in the entire parenting handbook. This is for your own good. This wasn't a reason. It was a magic shield used to justify absolutely anything miserable. It was deployed right before a terrible home haircut, a spoonful of medicine that tasted like gasoline, or forcing you to wear an itchy sweater knitted by a blind relative. The lesson wasn't about well-being. It was the ultimate power move. It taught us that their will, no matter how much we hated it, was somehow a selfless gift we should be grateful for. 29. Just ignore the bullies and they'll get bored and go away. This is the ultimate strategy of doing absolutely nothing and hoping for a miracle. Ignoring a bully doesn't make them vanish. It just confirms to them that you are a convenient, non-confrontational punching bag. It's terrible advice that schools still hand out today. In the real world, ignoring a problem usually makes it worse, not better. It taught us to be passive victims rather than teaching us how to actually stand up for ourselves or handle conflict effectively. 30. The ultimate parental problem solver. Go play outside. This wasn't a suggestion for healthy activity, it was an ejection sequence. It was the verbal equivalent of shoving you out the airlock with a vague command to be back before the streetlights come on. It was less about your vitamin D intake and more about their desperate need for 30 minutes of silence and a glass of wine. We roamed the neighborhood like feral packs of wolves, completely unsupervised, because our parents just wanted to watch their soap operas in peace. 31. Every dad in America had the same magical healing technique for any minor injury. A ridiculously oversized, flesh-colored bandage. It didn't matter if it was a microscopic paper cut or a pinprick. The solution was to slap a bandage on it that was big enough to cover a shark bite. This taught us that the appearance of medical care was often more important than the actual medical care itself. It was the placebo effect in adhesive form. Put a Band-Aid on it became the universal solution for physical and sometimes emotional pain. 32. The mandatory, non-negotiable afternoon nap. As a kid, this was treated as a prison sentence, a cruel punishment that stole precious hours of playtime. We fought it with every ounce of energy we had. The dumbest part of this lesson? It was actually the only one they got 100% right. We just didn't realize it until we were 35, tired, and would now brutally murder someone for the opportunity to take a nap at 2 p.m. Youth is wasted on the young, especially the part where you get mandatory sleep breaks. 33. Well, life isn't fair. This wasn't a piece of profound philosophical wisdom. It was the verbal white flag of lazy parenting. It was the official shutdown for any childhood complaint about injustice, from a sibling getting the bigger cookie to a genuinely unfair punishment. It didn't teach resilience. It taught you that your parents had officially given up on trying to be arbitrators of justice. It was a cynical shrug that said, "The world sucks, kid. Get used to it," which is hardly the inspiring message you want from your role models. 34. Cracking your knuckles will give you arthritis. This was presented as an undisputed medical fact, right up there with gravity and the need for oxygen. The goal wasn't to save you from future joint pain. It was solely to make you stop making that annoying popping sound that drove your mother crazy. A doctor actually cracked his knuckles on one hand for 60 years to disprove this. But parents didn't care about science. They cared about silence. It was a medical lie told for the sake of auditory peace. 35. You need to learn to share. This was the law of the playground, but let's look at the fine print. This rule only ever seemed to apply to the brand new expensive toy you just unwrapped for your birthday. The kid down the street wants to slime your new action man? Share! But when you wanted to play with dad's tools? Absolutely not. It was our first introduction to the baffling hypocrisy of authority figures. It taught us that property rights are fluid and usually depend on who is bigger, louder, and paying the mortgage. 36. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. This might be the single most damaging lie ever told to children. It was a well-intentioned attempt to teach resilience, but it was completely delusional. The reality is that a broken arm heals in 6 weeks, but being called Dumbo in the 3rd grade sticks with you until you're 45 and paying for therapy. Words don't just hurt. They leave scars that don't show up on X-rays. It taught us to bottle up our emotions until they exploded later in life. 37. Forget physics. Here's some real talk from Dad. You don't want to wear a seatbelt. You want to be thrown clear of the wreck. This was a genuine belief held by grown adults who thought being launched through a windshield like a human cannonball was a safety feature. The logic was that you didn't want to be trapped in a burning car, so obviously scraping along the asphalt at 60 miles per hour was the better option. It was a terrifying misunderstanding of inertia that probably explains why road safety statistics in the 70s were a nightmare. 38. The most powerful motivating force in the suburban universe. What will the neighbors think? This wasn't a question, it was a threat. It taught us that the most important moral compass wasn't our own conscience, but the imagined judgment of Mrs. Higgins next door. Your entire family's honor rested on you not crying in the driveway. It instilled a lifelong, crippling social anxiety where we value the opinions of people we don't even like over our own mental sanity. We weren't living our lives. We were performing for an audience that probably wasn't even watching. 39. When you touched a hot stove, what was the first thing Grandma told you to do? Put some butter on it. This wasn't just wrong, it was actively dangerous. We were literally basting ourselves like a Thanksgiving turkey. The butter seals in the heat and helps the skin fry a little longer. But nobody questioned Grandma's medical degree from the University of Old Wives' Tales. It taught us that traditional wisdom is often just a fancy way of saying, "We've been doing it wrong for generations, so why stop now?" 40. The terrifying medical diagnosis of square eyes. This was the inevitable result of watching too much television. Parents said it with such conviction that we genuinely pictured our eyeballs physically morphing into tiny flickering cubes. It was a piece of cartoonish body horror designed to make you fear the television as a device of monstrous transformation. It was absurd, but it worked. I still have a momentary panic attack if I binge watch a series for too long, checking the mirror to make sure my pupils are still round. 41. Drinking coffee will stunt your growth. This was the lie used to keep kids away from the expensive bean juice. We were terrified that one sip of Java would freeze our skeletal development instantly and leave us 4 feet tall for the rest of our lives. It had absolutely no scientific basis whatsoever. The truth was much simpler and darker. Parents just didn't want to deal with a hyperactive 7-year-old who was already bouncing off the walls without a double shot of espresso. They wanted the caffeine for themselves, and they were willing to give us a complex about our height just to protect their stash. 42. Thirsty on a summer day? Don't you dare go inside and track dirt on the carpet. Just drink directly from the garden hose. We were told it was perfectly fine, a refreshing blast of pure nature. In reality, we were chugging down a lukewarm cocktail of rubber particles, lead, stagnated water, and whatever spiders were living in the nozzle. It tasted like hot plastic and regret, but we drank it anyway. It explains why our generation has immune systems of steel. We spent our childhoods drinking straight from the swamp. 43. Spare the rod, spoil the child. This wasn't just a catchy saying, it was a complete management philosophy. It was the primitive HR policy for the family unit, teaching us that complex emotional or behavioral issues could be solved with the swift application of a wooden spoon or a belt. It taught us that violence is an acceptable problem-solving tool as long as you're the one in charge. It was character building in the same way that a bar fight is a networking event. 44. The most terrifying phrase in the English language, wait until your father gets home. This wasn't just a threat, it was psychological torture. It turned your afternoon into a 6-hour horror movie prologue. You had to sit there, stewing in your own dread, waiting for the sound of the car in the driveway. The crime was usually something minor like spilling juice. But by the time Dad got home, you had accepted your fate as a dead man walking. It taught us that the anticipation of punishment is always infinitely worse than the punishment itself. 45. The Great American Rite of Passage, the parking lot driving lesson. The core instruction wasn't about clutch control or parallel parking. It was about learning to operate a 2-ton metal death machine while a red-faced man screams contradictory advice in your right ear. Turn left. No, the other left. Brake. Why are you stopping? It was less of a driving lesson and more of a stress test for future combat pilots. If you could park a sedan while your dad was having an aneurysm next to you, you could handle anything. 46. Don't stand in front of the microwave or you'll get radiation poisoning. Parents acted like the microwave was a miniature Chernobyl sitting on the kitchen counter. If you stared at your popcorn popping, they screamed as if you were absorbing lethal doses of gamma rays that would mutate your DNA. We treated that appliance with the same caution as a nuclear warhead. In reality, the metal mesh screen protects you completely, but moms everywhere were convinced that heating up a burrito was a high-risk activity that required safety goggles and a hazmat suit. 47. Need a job? Just march right in there, give the manager a firm handshake, and look him in the eye. This advice is repeated by every boomer parent to this day, completely ignoring the existence of the internet, keyword filters, and security guards who will tase you for bypassing the front desk. If you try this at a Google office today, you won't get a job. You'll get a restraining order. It taught us that our parents' understanding of the modern economy ended sometime around the Reagan administration. 48. Feed a cold, starve a fever. Or was it starve a cold, feed a fever? Nobody ever really knew, but everyone repeated it with the absolute certainty of a seasoned doctor. This was less a piece of medical advice and more of a confusing dietary roulette you played while feeling like death. You'd be shivering with a fever while your mom debated whether to give you soup or lock the fridge. It taught us that folk medicine is mostly just rhyming words that have a 50-50 chance of making you feel worse. 49. The old barbershop myth: if you shave, the hair will grow back thicker, darker, and angrier. This piece of pseudoscience was so powerful, it stopped entire generations from touching a razor until it was way too late. We walked around with embarrassing peach fuzz mustaches because we were terrified of waking up looking like a werewolf. It wasn't about biology, it was a scare tactic designed to delay the inevitable onset of adulthood. It didn't work, of course, but it did make for some really awkward school photos. So, we have officially proven that our parents were basically professional con artists just trying to survive the day. Now, I want the truth. Which one of these absolutely idiotic lies do you still secretly follow today out of pure fear? Or are you currently traumatizing your own grandkids with the cracked knuckles myth just for some peace and quiet? Confess your crimes in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you want to deprogram your brain and stop eating floor pizza.